Jane?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Jerry. And I just wanted to today go through about, I guess it's 6, 7, 8 projects that are a range of sizes that Denise and I have worked on over the years. Let's say this is over the past, I don't know, 5, 10 years at the most. And there are many, many more projects in this. We work probably on 8, 10 projects a year for a variety of clients. Everything from Jerry was saying he's been a client of ours for at UBC, but City of Vancouver, for instance, has hired us many times for a range of projects. One of which, as you see on the page here, is Granville Street. But it also could be neighborhoods, and I'll get into one or two of those neighborhoods. And then following that, we're just going to tell you about projects that are larger and larger scopes, and finally ending with something that is, 1,000 square kilometers up in the Yukon Territory. So quite a range of projects, but we find that the cultural landscape approach, whereby we look at let's say the pattern of human settlement on the site and activities, present activities and past activities. We look at this as a terrific way of expanding our clients' sense of heritage. Often these are come to us as heritage planning studies, and we turn them into more than just looking at buildings or just looking at very specific things, opening up let's say the horizons of our clients. So the first one we're showing here is the heritage recommendations for Granville Street. I don't know if you are familiar with Vancouver greatly, but you can see in the picture that it is a pedestrian street now, mostly pedestrian street. And it's full of buildings from the Edwardian era, which was the boomtown for Vancouver's. But also there's a mix of buildings from later eras, and was for a time these few blocks of Granville Street were the entertainment center of the city. It fell on hard times in recent decades, in that it was a sort of a down and out area, although still with theaters. The city of Vancouver came to us hoping for design guideline recommendations. The planner involved thought they wanted from us almost a set of design guidelines to establish a character for the street. And Denise and I recognize that it's a delicate task to steer clients away from this sort of limited sense of design guidelines being the way to conserve the culture of a place. So we ease them into more of a discussion of themes and strategies for the future of the street. One of which was to care for the Edwardian buildings, or sometimes the later buildings, but more importantly, to address the vitality of the street and to recognize its diversity of activities, and particularly its theatrical nature now. And so the report, and I think I'll just switch to the next page that shows you the contents. The report involved high-level strategies to retain heritage value, which was not only about caring for the existing buildings, but for caring for the existing life. And this came as a bit of a surprise, or a bit of a shake-up to the client, but nevertheless, it was welcomed in the end as being the right way of going at it. So this is just an example page. The strategy was to recognize it as a place with distinctly highly visible identity in the neighborhood, and do things to support that, rather than to narrowly look at whether or not buildings need to have cornices or windows of a certain size. Um, and so another strategy was basically to pump up the theatricality of the place. In other words, really support the nightlife and the boisterous activity. And that's getting at the nature of the place, or getting at the essence of the place. What I'd like to do is, before I introduce the next project, I'd like to just ask if anyone has any questions about our approach on any of these projects. I should just say that this is an example where we did not go out into the community and have community consultations. This was a more limited, let's say, process where we had a series of discussions with the planners involved, and we would bring in our reading of literature, etc., of the place to inform our discussions. Any questions on Granville Strip and expanding the horizons of the client from being more than design guideline to strategy for caring for its culture? If nothing, then I will move on. Here's another example, also from Vancouver. This is an industrial area near the port. Interesting because it had a very specific physical quality to it, which was a line of warehouse buildings near a rail track. But it had a mixed history over the time. Being near the port, it was also a place where there were some brothels and some sort of, let's say, seedy nightlife. More recently, it's become a bit of a hive of high-tech activity. So there's sort of a hipster element to the area now, where young people are renting office space in these old warehouses and, basically working on internet projects, etc. The city wanted to get a sense of what the quality of the place was in order to help with the future planning of it. This involved a little bit more community engagement, in that we would identify individuals to talk to who had a sense of the history of the place or its contemporary culture, and using those interviews to give the city a better sense of what is valuable about the neighborhood to its community, what are the key places that are important to people who live there or work there, and what they see as a future for the neighborhood. Those three questions: what do you value about the neighborhood? What do you value, or what key places are there in the neighborhood? And what do you see for its future? Are three questions Denise and I often put to a community as a way of engaging them in a discussion about what is valuable about the place. One way we find that people get into understanding what is valuable about a place is we ask them about particular key areas or key places in the neighborhood, and that leads them into a discussion of why it's important. And that's what's particularly important in our interviews with community, is we not only find out what is important to a community in their neighborhood or in their town or whatever, but why it's important. And this informs us in our reports as to where the community is going and what is valuable about it. And you get a sense of the whole culture of the place much more easily than if you just simply ask them what, and you don't ask the why or get the why out of the community. So this report had an historical context statement. It had, from that, we extracted a value statement, why or what about the area was valuable, and priority places and features. That's terminology that the City of Vancouver wants to use. That brings me to a side point, whereas we try to use the language of the client when they come to us. They think they're looking for priority places, and we first have to understand what they mean by that, and then we give it back to them. So that we're trying to give them tools that they use normally, but with our understanding brought to those tools. We map things so that the clients normally see an array of, let's say, priority places on a map. I don't know if I don't have it for this project, but you will see it in some other projects. And we just put together reports where people's understanding of the place, ordinary citizens or whatever, are integrated into our understanding of the value of the place. And this is communicated to our clients. What we find when we ask community what is important about a place for them and why, we find that it's not a dry exercise. People are genuinely, usually, very excited about where they live or work. And you get out of them, if you simply ask them what they find important, what they value about the place, why they like being where they are. Ordinary questions like that get them talking, especially if it's a community around a table and there's a map on the table. And you'll see some more examples of that, or I'll tell you more examples of that when we get into small communities in rural BC or Yukon. But here's an example of just us attending certain community events just to hang around and ask questions. And that's usually a terrific way of getting a group of people around a table starting to talk about the place. Very important to do. Questions? I'm going on to the next project now.
James, before you leave that, Jerry here.
Yep.
Could you talk about the question you have about the future?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
What surfaces, what you find often surfacing to the top from that's different from the other?
Right. It works two ways. On several projects, and you'll see some of them later, there's a terrible anxiety about what is going to happen about a certain place. I'm thinking of Riverview Lands is one of the projects that I'll be presenting. People love the way a place is, or they fear what it might become. And so often what Denise and I do at a community meeting is simply say, if you had your wish, if you were, the dictator, what would be the feature of this place that would be best for you? What do you see happening here? How is it best going to live? And it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, you often get different answers, like there's perhaps quite different visions for a place. And that is something to be considered. But often also you will see an underlying unifying idea or something about a place. And that's terribly important and very helpful in these studies. So talking about the vision or the future of a place is often one way we can understand shared values.
So in that, I assume that's sort of the last set of questions you ask, or it might be iterative. But do you find and it sounds like people don't necessarily lock into, I want it to stay the way it is, and that is there.
Well, what often happens is that it's a conversation around a table. We also have questionnaires that some people don't feel comfortable speaking about their, thoughts on an area out loud, but they're happy to sit in a corner and write out in questionnaire form their vision for the future. And and so what we get is some people are more comfortable talking about vision. Others are more comfortable talking about places of value to them, and others are more interested in just talking stories about, this is what happened 20 years ago, and and it meant something to me. And so we find that if you have several questions like vision, places, um, ideas, stories, a variety of ways for people to engage in telling us what is of value about the place to them. It's better if you have these different ways of addressing the same issue, basically.
Excellent.
Will that answer your question?
That's great. It's quite insightful.
Okay.
I'd like to ask a question about the individuals that you interview. How do you go about determining who you'd like to speak to?
Right. Often there's a working group that is our client. So, for instance, an example would have been that Jerry may remember when we were first looking at UBC's Point Grey campus. There was a working group formed that was in part faculty, staff, and there was also an advisor to, like, Barry Downs, the architect. And it would be a roundtable discussion that would feel free enough that people would sort of take off on an idea and expand on it, and that would lead to a suggestion of maybe you should talk to so and so, or maybe you should investigate this group or whatever. And that's all recorded during these meetings and filed away for follow-up conversations. So it's like a tree that grows and grows and grows.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions before I move on?
Well, just
Okay. Oh yeah.
As you say, the tree that grows and grows and grows, and so part of I guess successful of supporting a place is allowing people to hear each other's views and of what's of value, and then seeing this tree grow. So, as you just talked through your projects, if you just highlight sort of different ways you do that sharing in advance of just the final report to build this alignment.
Right. The two reports that I've just spoken about were quite limited in terms of their community output. In that there weren't formal open houses or workshops. And I think the rest that you will see will have had actual meetings or open houses or workshops. So I'll just get into the next one, which was one of the earlier projects, actually, in this whole list of projects we're showing you. And really, I think, turned Denise and I onto this sort of cultural landscape way of thinking, in that there's this area in Vancouver called Powell Street, Japantown, that is now part of the downtown east side, a highly politicized area of town, in that it's turf that's been fought over for 100 years, basically, and has an enormously complex history and current reality. And the city of Vancouver wanted to understand the, let's say, the history of the place and what is of value about it in advance of planning studies that have subsequently gone ahead and been completed. But we were engaged to engage with the community, basically, in part, and also in part to write a brief history of the place, and somehow engage the community. And we did this through a series of engagements with a working group that that drew from both the historical Japanese Canadian population and the contemporary downtown East Side population, which some of you may know is one of the poorest areas in Canada in terms of per capita income. So a brief history of Powell Street, Japantown, is that it's very near the port, right by Railtown, in fact, and was for a period up till 1942 the center of Japanese Canadian culture in Canada. And then, of course, with the war, they were forcibly relocated, and property was confiscated, and it was just a terrible, disruption of their lives and of the city. And that repair is still the repair of that rupture is still being worked out. The area now has almost no Japanese Canadian presence. There is the Japanese Canadian Vancouver Japanese Language School, Japanese Hall, still there as an institution that's terribly important to the Japanese Canadian community. But other than that, there are very few remnants of the Japanese Canadian culture there. However, it's all there still. When you look for it, there are all sorts of signs of the Japanese Canadian culture there. On top of that, overlaid that, there is the contemporary culture that is almost like now it's part a contemporary urban Aboriginal community, and part just a down and out community for the very poor and the drug addicted. So it's a very, very complex culture there now. And so our consultations were in the form of same questions. What do you value about the place? Why do you value it? What important pieces of the place are important to you and why? What's your vision for the future of the place? All of these same questions done in sort of a round table. We discuss themes that might, this is actually an important point. When you're doing when we do a cultural landscape study, we talk about values and themes. And they're a way that people can move away or back away from positional attitudes towards things. So, for instance, I'm just going to move on to our themes. I can move back if you feel like I need to, but we put together about 9 or 10 themes that formed our discussions. And in the room, there would be Japanese Canadian representatives, current businessmen, some street people, in some cases, representatives of the drug addicted community, etc. Right? And there was a discussion about the basic nature of the place, and that was distilled into these themes, which you can see. Sorry. So First Nations presence. The beauty about themes is they cross time. You can have a theme, and a theme should cross time. So First Nations presence not only dealt with the presence of the Coast Salish people on the site before contact, but also with the contemporary urban Aboriginal community. Many of the individuals are from other places in Canada. So First Nations presence is an enduring theme or enduring reality, let's say, about the area. And so we just find this thematic approach so valuable in that it pulls together events and realities across time and gives you a sense of the place being an enduring. There's a coherent story to the place. The other is Heart of the City. that alludes to the fact that it was one of the earliest neighborhoods in the city, but it also alludes to the fact that for the present down and out, let's say, population of the city, that this is their city. This is what they believe to be their city. And others in the city feel that if we don't deal with this part of the city well, then we're not dealing with the heart of the city well. So these themes are beautifully malleable. You can work with them in many ways and get people from different camps, let's say, or different preconceptions to fall into an agreement in ways. And it's a beautiful thing to see, and it really does work. Welcoming community is another way of, of weaving together stories about the Salish people welcoming newcomers, about newcomers welcoming even newer comers, and about the city dealing with its down and out population now. It's just, these themes can help people loosen up and think about things creatively. I need to go more into that. I think this is a very key aspect to the way we work with communities and process the information from them through themes and values within those themes. We felt we had to have a theme. The Japanese Canadian population felt we needed to have a theme specifically about the Japanese Canadian settlement of the place. So it's it's a thematic framework that is a feature of many of our cultural landscape studies, if not all of them. We work with the client so that they feel it's a document that reflects their reality.
So, James, where did this go from? You're moving to the next project?
Yes, I won't. I'll wait for your comment.
So, where did this go from here? Because if I just in reading, skimming through some of these themes, one would think the next step would be to develop strategies, principles and strategies for helping to nurture the community in the future. And just like around the theme of welcoming. But what you said your client wanted, and I know the city of Vancouver wants that, they want priority places or resources. So how did that, where did that land?
Well, in the case of the Powell Street area, some years after this was produced, the city did embark on a very extensive planning review for the downtown east side. And this was one of the, let's say, foundational reports that they used to help organize discussion. All I can say is that in our own reports, sometimes we move from these thematic understandings to strategies. It's a very clear. There's a very clear lineage between one and the other. You can see that one needs to deal with these ideas in the strategies.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of the downtown east side planning, this report, for instance, helped understand that the current situation has many commonalities, or there are many commonalities with the Japanese Canadian population, for instance, wanting to commemorate the place as well. There are many commonalities. Okay, on we go.
May I ask a quick question, sorry, before you move on? In terms of the participants in your community engagement, when you had such a diverse group from business people to those who are down on their luck and out on the streets, do you find that you have to manage the dynamics of the power dynamics in the room to ensure that everyone who wants to share an opinion does share an opinion? Or does it sort itself out in some way?
Yes, that's a good question. Of course, it doesn't work to bring some people in close contact with other people if you don't feel like you're going to get the real goods, let's say. So, for
Okay.
instance, I've just moved the presentation material back to a page where it shows interviewees, etc. And 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 also team members. There were team members on this project that specifically were chosen in order to go and sit with uh, elderly First Nations people in the downtown east side and just listen to their stories.
Mm.
Um, and there's no other way of getting the value of the place for them out of them in any other
Mm-hmm.
way.
Right.
And so that's just an example of
Okay.
how you need to do it. And we have many projects where First Nations are a component, and there's
Mm-hmm.
a very specific way and respect required
Yes.
to deal with.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I'll quickly go through this one. This is back to more of a planning study. I think I'll just introduce it. This is also like a UBC campus study. This was a study of the British Columbia Institute of Technology campus. They asked us for, basically a tool to help them understand what was valuable physically on the site, and we turned that into these are the physically important places, but this is also why. And they found the why was very valuable. They felt in the end that they understood what they were dealing with much more as a result. And again, we just put it into themes that somehow came out of the place itself. So one of them was, for instance, form and function. That theme addressed architectural issues, but also a notion or a sort of a functionality about the place, sort of a prosaic functionality about the place. Anyway, we produced maps like this that identified places, but behind this there was a why. Why was this? Why are these places important? And I think the study has helped the institution move on with its planning, which is now underway. Also helps, this is just a note to say, it also helps to have a variety of imagery in your reports to underscore the points you're making with your words. This is an example. Now we're moving to a larger scale. This is a whole city, Port Coquitlam, a city that is outside of the main center of Vancouver, but now in its sort of the conurbation, it's part of the Greater Vancouver. Denise and I find that many of our projects in smaller communities, there is an enormous pride in the place. And all you have to do is meet with them and begin to engage with them about what they love about their place. And all the information just comes out. What's important, why it's important, what they loved about their community and their culture. It all comes out. If you sit around a table with a few maps, or you write down, Denise and I go into these communities ready to just listen. We underscore the point that they are the experts about the value of the place, and that we are here to record what they're saying and give it back to them in a coherent way. It's really community-based, values-based conservation that we're doing. And in the case of Port Coquitlam, it is the landscape as well as the buildings are very important. And so the other thing that people are delighted by in in our consultations with them is we're not just looking at buildings. We're looking at landscapes, features, events, people, everything. And they get a holistic sense of their heritage and what they value as a result. So the thematic framework in this case was a lovely, concise tool that helped us organize the priority places or heritage features or whatever you want to call them, but also helped people understand that these are ideas or concepts about their place that strike home. So, for instance, the last theme there is hometown and heroes. This was a very strong part of Port Coquitlam's feedback to us, is that they are fiercely proud of their working class background, no pretensions, etc. And that sort of feedback needs to be found in the words so that they feel that they have been heard.
Could you speak to the theme tenacity and prosperity?
Sure.
That sounds provocative. So, and did they do anything with that in that you know of since then?
Well, I'll just read the sentence under that. This theme highlights the pioneering travails of settling the lowlands and the presence of the Coquitlam First Nation. So again, this is an example of how a theme can pull together quite disparate elements of a society. It was a way of saying, we heard from many people that they're great stories of, their parents arriving from somewhere else and just, toughing it out in the early years or something like that. But in the case of this study, the Coquitlam First Nation decided not to participate, and that is not an uncommon occurrence. Is that the First Nations are often very wary of any planning exercise, especially one that attempts to tell a history, because they feel that it's all a biased white history, basically. But nevertheless, Denise and I feel that it's important to at least acknowledge, even though we've not engaged directly with a First Nation in a particular area, to acknowledge to the rest of the community that there is this aspect of their culture that needs to be incorporated. If not closely in this report, it needs to be in the future. They need to keep remembering that this is an issue. So tenacity and prosperity talked about the Coquitlam still being there in spite of the fact that their lands were taken and basically they were confined to a small area of what was once their territory. But it also addressed that small town pioneering. This is what it once was. We started out with nothing and we've made it into something. And there was a tremendous amount of that energy in Port Coquitlam. Very, very, very proud of their history and let's say hardworking history.
So
Is that
James,
your question?
Yeah. So I have lots of questions here. I need to leave this call at this time. So I just want to make sure that everybody that's joined, if they received the 3 questions that I had circulated, if everyone could just confirm that verbally.
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, I've got them.
Excellent. Okay. So if at the end you have as well, good. So if you could send those just to there's an email there, just send it to my attention, your thoughts at the end of that. And Ev, if you can, Ev and James, if you can just continue to facilitate this. And okay. I will record this and send out the recording to all those that said they were interested but have not been able to show perhaps technical reasons as well. So just my last question. One is I don't see on the bottom of your team list here any First Nations representation, whereas I see in some of your other projects. Would have that changed that dynamic that you just spoke about?
Well, in this case, in this report, I think it's not shown here. We actually mentioned in the report, it was highlighted that the Coquitlam First Nation elected not to be part of the consultation. And so it was made very specific that they were not interested, and that and so it wasn't glossed over. It was highlighted by us that this was a gaping hole, let's say, in our consultation, but not one that we could force. I mean, it wasn't for us to do to force them to be part of it.
Right. Though I guess my question is, in other instances, you had brought in First Nations team players.
Yes.
From your learnings from other projects, is there anything that you've learned since, a strategy of which to a way to work closer to getting First Nations participation?
Well, it helps to try to ask them how they want to participate is our approach, basically. And because we understand and respect their view that sometimes their non-involvement is their right and their proper way of dealing with things. So later we'll see a project that is the regional district of Okanagan-Similkameen. We had much better representation both on the team but also as participators from the First Nations involved there. And up in the Yukon, it always involves the First Nations. You have to. It's so important to get their voice in any of it. So that's my answer to you. Sometimes we get some and sometimes we can't. And we'd always like to, but it's up to them. Okay, Jerry?
Thank you very much.
All right. I'll move on.
Yes.
Here's a and goodbye, Jerry.
James.
Here's a very interesting project. Riverview Lands was a mental institution from the early 20th century till very recently. Well, there still is some services on the site, but an enormously complex site in that the community around Riverview were deeply, deeply suspicious of the future of the site. The province of British Columbia owns the site and wants to consider its future after it's decommissioned fully as a mental health institution. It is that quintessential huge institutional building site, full of older buildings, very large scale, that were housing basically mentally ill people early in the 20th century. And then as treatment for mental illness changed, and the site became basically no longer required to house the people. Basically, it's because of drug therapy radically changing the way mental health is now dealt with. So the property was up for grabs, basically, and the in terms of what its future use would be, and the local community was fiercely invested in having it a community-based facility somehow still, and the provincial government was pretty equally certain that they wanted to make use of the site for its highest and best use. which was housing probably. So there was this background tension that had been going on for years before this plan was commissioned. And what we did was we basically put together again a series of open houses, workshops with the community, asked them what they valued about the place, did historical research ourselves to produce a historical context, and gave that to the community, all as an exercise in understanding what the community valued about the place and communicating that to the province. The study was not about what to do with the project, with the property in the future. That was for another project later. And so we had to keep reminding all players involved that we were simply asking them what they found valuable about the place. And similar to the projects that I've already spoke to you about, we went through the steps of interviewing people, having open houses, having people sit around tables with maps, trading stories about the history of the place. All of this material was then integrated into, here's again the Coquitlam First Nation not participating. Anyway, all of this information was then integrated into a document that was in part a chronology with mapping that helped people understand the history of the place, and also thematic framework, which showed, in this case, this theme was the worked landscape. It's a culturally modified, beautiful culturally modified landscape, where the hillside was originally forest that was then logged and made into broad lawns in some places with very monumental hospital buildings. Beautiful tree collection, and just a very peaceful, large landscape that initially was part of the theory about healing mentally ill people. That is, the patients were initially used to maintain the grounds, like do the gardening, but also the grounds were a place of peace and quiet, and that was felt to be beneficial to their mental health. So I'm just showing you a few random pages inside the study that sort of meticulously linked places that people really wanted us to record as being important to them, and relating those back to the themes. So whether it would be the theme of the working landscape, or in this case, down at the bottom of the page, you see the grand building design, modest addition. So whether it was the architecture or the landscape or some other aspect of the site. Hello? Did someone say something? Okay. So
James, sorry, just a quick question. Maybe this is general to most of the projects, but I'm wondering. I guess knowing that some clients may want to jump to conclusions right away and have immediate actions, and how do you? I guess there's probably a part of educating your client as well in the need to do these exercises and consultation.
Yes. We're rather lucky in BC in that there was the Heritage Branch maybe 10, 15 years ago under Alistair Carr.
Yes.
Was very forward in promoting this values-based understanding of places. And so, which was quite a change from the original heritage let's say, heritage communities' understanding about what they were doing, which was namely saving old buildings, and sort of, maybe this is not quite fair, but tarting up Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
So our work was, we still do have to do quite a bit of almost education around the need for developing themes to understand or to organize, let's say, how people value a place. But more and more, we find that our clients are understanding that that's a very good way of going at it. Yeah, we don't seem to have to convince so many, let's say, staff in various municipalities or regions about that anymore. The one problematic place we find are the old historical sites, the groups around old historical communities, and in British Columbia, that would be, towns that were full of old houses and rallied around to save them in the 1970s, right? Those communities we find, are more locked into the old style of thinking, which is saving, brackets and reproducing windows and cornices and all the rest of it. And if that is done, then everything's fine. There's that more, let's say, more limited sense of conservation occurs in those established heritage communities. Am I being clear?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. But we do find that the public still always needs educating, that they're always surprised that we're asking about landscapes or artifacts or events or, dam sites, not just buildings on Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example, actually a great example of just what we've been speaking about. Denise and I did a project for the Yale and Fraser Canyon area. It was a heritage context study and heritage strategic plan, and involved community meetings up and down basically up and down the Fraser Canyon. For those of you who don't know the Fraser Canyon, it's this very unusual river bed, basically canyon, that links the coast with the interior. Very unusual. It's a rift valley, major river flowing through very constricted area, and has been since First Nations were first here, a cultural corridor, and also a place to fight over, because the salmon coming up the Fraser were, very plentiful in their seasons, and there would be sites that would be perfect for netting these salmon and drying them. And so it was not only a communication corridor, but it was also a place to fight over resources. So it has that interesting history to it. And then more recently, the rail history of Canada, because both the Canadian Pacific Railway and the CNR have their rights of way to the Pacific coast through this canyon. And it has this amazing, complex gold rush history, which has a complex cultural history of there being Chinese miners and American miners and all these populations coming together in dramatic ways over its history. So very interesting place. And we were charged with putting together basically a strategic plan for how to care for its heritage. And again, the same format of community consultations. We would go into a small town or community or school. There'd be 10 people in the room at the most sometimes. And we would just simply ask them what they found valuable about their place, and why, and what did they see in the future, and all these same questions, just ordinarily asked, nothing terribly academic, and you get all the stories coming out, and we record them all and integrate them into our statements. So I think that explains that. Again, greater in scale, and more recently, a regional heritage strategic plan for a whole region of the province. We should probably tell you a little bit about the particular or the special nature of BC, in that there are these regional districts. I don't think this happens back east, or maybe nor in the prairies, but BC is divided into a series of regions, each with their own government, local government. And they have local government powers, like a city or like a municipality, but they're this other governing body, and they are very interesting because they have broad range of powers over not only the towns but the landscape. And so cultural landscape studies are a perfect vehicle, let's say, for considering the heritage or the planning of the region. And so one example is of the Okanagan-Similkameen. You may know that the Okanagan and the Similkameen are now, they're desert climates, which surprises many. But they're the very northern end of the Sonoran Desert that reaches right down to Mexico. And they're now, in the last 100 years, have been prime agricultural land for, with the help of irrigation, for fruit trees and now wine production. However, the towns are everything from old mining towns in far-flung corners of the region to quite modern small cities like Penticton, still quite agricultural, and then quite depopulated in the mountainous areas within the region as well. Very, very various landscape and culture. And so we find that the cultural landscape study vehicle is great for dealing with diversity. So you can easily say, a region has distinct subcultures, and that's part of its nature, and it's very easily worked into the framework, let's say, of a cultural landscape study. So this study involved looking at the current situation, which was its physical context. We talked about its culture through its thematic framework. We talked about its regional government structure and emerging trends in tourism and heritage conservation as being part of this planning study that they commissioned. So we're using the cultural landscape lens, let's say, to do a strategic plan. Hello, did someone say something? No? Okay. And that included heritage conservation, and we got into that in detail, and you can read this at your leisure, but I don't think I will bore you about it now. I think this is the final project that I wanted to just share with you, which is the Keno Hill Silver Mining District up in the Yukon, really far from anywhere. That's just it was a major silver mining district as late as the 50s and 60s, but the history of the silver mining extended back into the 19th century. The reason for the study was that the mining operation basically has come to an end, and yet there is a whole landscape over several mountains that has been altered by the silver mining in the area since the 19th century. And all of it is, let's say, toxic because of the mining operations. And so there's a winding up of the mining operation. The current owner of the mining rights has entered into an agreement with the federal government and the Yukon government to remediate the region as a way of getting out of the region, with the region being restored to health. Importantly, this report integrated the input from the local First Nation, the Natcho-Nayak-Dun, and was integrated not only in terms of who we were speaking with, but their vision for the future, and was terribly important to making this report a whole. Without the Natcho-Nayak-Dun, it would not have made sense. The Yukon government knew that and involved them in a very integral way. So the interesting thing about this is that we see with cultural landscape study, the cultural landscape study model, you can integrate quite disparate, let's say, concerns. In this case, soil remediation and conservation of heritage were considered at the same time. An example is that the mining company had put budgets together for the remediation of soil in all these places that involved bulldozing down any structures, removing any foreign material and replanting it. What this study proposed is a conservation of some of those structures, etc., while remediating soils and finding ways of managing both of those concerns at the same time. And so the outcome of this is still in the works, but it was a wonderful example for Denise and I of how different disciplines, not necessarily associated with, doesn't seem like it's associated with heritage conservation. Nevertheless, it's the conservation of natural values and the conservation of cultural values together that made this report very interesting for us to work on. I think I'll end there. I don't think there's really more to explore in detail unless you have questions.
Maybe a question about this this last document, James, because I guess in this case it was really I guess the objective was to find about remediation work and safeguarding valued heritage resources. Yes. Or features. So that was, I guess, as opposed to the previous studies, which were based on thematic. Was this document prepared more with a, I guess, action oriented or
yes.
Yes. So it was more mitigation strategies for the remediation.
Basically, this study was trying to move the focus from remediation to conservation mm-hmm. of values. Mm-hmm. That's what it was. Okay. And those values being conserved were not only natural values and values that the Natcho-Nayak-Dun particularly held, which was the health of the land. They were very concerned that the health of the land be restored, of course, but that it also but they, you know, the Nashonak Dun and others, there's a long history now of employment in the mining industry amongst them. And so they came to see that the conservation of values was in part making the soil healthy again, the country healthy again, but also honoring the employment history in the mining industry. And so there was a great coming together or unifying of both the natural and cultural resources.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Yes, it is. That was a wonderful example. Anything else, you guys? If not, does anyone know how to stop these things?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, James. This is really, really quite fascinating. I think that I mean it's very generous of you to share this methodology with us, and yeah, I think it's really quite impressive what you've achieved with these reports. I actually had a chance to attend a presentation you gave of the Riverview land studies. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago in Montreal.
Oh yes,
an event around, I guess, the hospitals in Montreal, which is
that's right.
And so I'm curious. What is happening to that property in particular? Is there
Well, I'd be interested to know. I was hoping you were going to be able to tell me how it was going, but my impression was sorry.
Sorry, James. I was asking about the Riverview lands. What was happening with that in terms of the?
Okay.
Yes, I can tell you the hospitals.
It's all happening at a glacial pace. That's the answer. It's there's really nothing to report. It's in the hands of a ministry that's in charge of housing for the province, and there's been no next sort of public process that started yet.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm very interested to know my impression for Montreal, the hospital sites, was that I could see that there was a terrific symbiosis, and that it looked like a very likely match between the institution and the site itself. Looked good.
So there's actually several hospital complexes that are a challenge. One of them is the Victoria, the Royal Victoria Hospital, which is, I guess, probably the best known one. And it seems that I mean, as far as I know, the McGill University is going ahead with acquisition of the property. With the intent to, I mean, it seems quite positive. They're intending to return some of the grounds that were used for parking to Mount Royal Park, and then there's going to be some selective demolition of the more recent additions that were made to the hospital complex. But the intent is really to use the building for university purposes. So that's quite promising in terms of the use of that complex. I think what some people are worried about is the trickle effect that will have on other properties other heritage properties that are owned by the university, and what will happen to those smaller properties. So that's to be continued. Interesting story to follow. There's another complex which is the Hôtel Dieu Hospital, which is
Yeah.
a speaking hospital not very far from the Royal Vic. It's also on Mount Royal,
Yeah.
and that has actually been acquired in part by the City of Montreal. So
Oh,
there's
okay.
a way now, and that's
Yeah.
actually quite positive as well. Yeah, things seem
So
to
we
be
use
heading in a positive
repurposed
direction.
to be repurposed
Repurposed
for.
probably for community use.
Yeah.
I know that there was a very keen interest from the local community that it remain community use,
Well,
and
both hospitals in particular were repeatedly noted as being, I was born there, my mother was born there, my father was born there, etc., etc. Very important. Yeah.
yes.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Okay.
Thanks
So,
very much, James, for the presentation. It
okay.
was really
I just
informative.
have one question. Is that possible?
What's that?
This is Sarah Kinghead here. I was just wondering, can I have just one question?
Yeah, sure.
If possible. This is perhaps not entirely on topic, but it is related. I'm wondering how useful, what kind of whether cultural landscape reports can help to sway municipal kind of directions in terms of planning. I'm interested particularly in an area I live in the Niagara region, that has considerable, let's say, Indigenous archaeological potential, but is being systematically ignored. And I wonder, I know it's not meant to be a tool to lever municipal decisions, but I
Well,
understand it's more about advising
what
than
we find,
advocacy.
is the cultural landscape model allows a community to identify that things such as archaeological sites are terribly
Yeah.
important themselves. So, but to put it in context with all these other things that are also important. So, I would say that the value of how we practice anyway our cultural landscape studies is that it gives a very holistic view about the value of a place, and each, let's say, how would I put it? Subculture can find a home within that. So, for instance, the group that finds the archaeological sites being terribly important to them can that should be part of a value statement about the place, but along with all the other things that allow other people to feel like their issues of value are also addressed. So it's a wonderful vehicle for bringing, let's say, diverse opinions together under one umbrella, let's say. And we find that's best done through the development of a thematic framework that allows people to understand that this is why archaeological sites are important to us, and this is why our old buildings are important to us, and this is why our clean air is important to us, and this is why
Right.
all of these things come together in an inclusive way.
Right. No, so that's a good. I like that the notion of the thematic framework. I think that's very, and also as you said, identifying
They
the
require. Yeah, Denise and I find that they're a creative thing. You have to find the right words to encompass the ideas that you've heard, and it's nice to work between us. We back and forth a bit to say, well, that doesn't quite capture this, that, and the other thing. So it's not it's a creative thing. You're not just copying something else down. It's based on the standards, the Canadian. There's a Canadian framework, right? But it's very generic in its wording, and we find that to take those ideas and make them specific to a place really helps the community understand their place.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe,
Okay, you
maybe
guys.
just
Oh, yes. No
sorry,
problem.
James. One last question on that topic of thematic framework and finding the right words. I had the opportunity of attending the meeting in Florence 2 years ago, and one thing that really came out, and I'm wondering how you deal with this, working with such a broad range of community, is, I mean, essentially the question of language and I guess words and values that exist in some cultural contexts, but not in all cultural contexts. And for example, the question of one thing that came out of this meeting in Florence is that the question of landscape and cultural landscape is something that doesn't exist, for example, in Arabic, and so that I guess you have to find other ways of communicating these concepts. Is that something that you tackle?
Well, yes. We've not dealt with, I guess the closest parallel is when we're dealing with First Nations cultures, that it's a completely different frame of reality, let's say, or can be. And
Yes.
that, I guess what we do is we try to use their words as closely as we can.
Yes. Okay.
So, you know, and to be very sensitive to trying to do that. The example in the downtown east side in the Japantown, Powell Street Japantown project is that some of those, for instance, the theme Heart of the City came from the community. And when they saw that wording, that exact wording, they felt they'd been hurt.
Mm-hmm.
So the words have power. The words have that much power. If they see, or if they see in your report or hear you speak using their words, that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't underscore strongly enough the fact that we do, Denise and I do view these reports as the community speaking.
Yes.
We really are trying to channel their thoughts with our expertise, but channeling their thoughts and their knowledge about their place.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Are
Well,
we
thank
done?
you very much.
Okay.
Unless anyone else has questions, I guess, thank you very much, James, for your time, for your thoughts, and for sharing this fascinating work with us. And thank you everyone for participating. Just a reminder that we welcome your input, and you have a bit of homework to do this afternoon, please. So we would very much appreciate if you could have a look at those questions that Jerry sent around and send us your responses. This is all feeding into I guess our exercise in view of communicating a Canadian position on cultural landscapes at the next ICOMOS General Assembly in Delhi in 2017.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Shadjan.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Can you get that thing? I was just shopping for scooters. Oh, right. I forget the scooter. Oh, yeah? Yeah. No. Cool. No, I want to put a bike in it. Oh, yeah. Anytime you want to ride a scooter, you can ride a bike. That's fair. Yeah. Well, the boys like to when like go up to scooters anywhere. Just I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So actually, the worst part is we actually ordered 3 online. 3? 3. Can you have one and get them to? Oh no. So we ordered them and we have them in our bedroom. Well, I was like, can we? But they don't. My mind is like, where? So your Christmas present. But then yeah. Yeah. I like the philosophy of like fundamentally part of your you need to get around your Christmas gift. Well, clothes and food were also. That's true. That's a good point. Yeah, man. But on the other hand, it's like yeah. She loved it. She loved it. She's used that like not people here. Yeah. But she was going for everybody else and then because yours is given to me. I'm not concerned. He is showing up. She does all right.
So you and Sam, scooter guy, scooter guy, he just like carried around the tracks. Like he like carries as many of those little tracks of the trains in his arms as he can, and like just like that. And I set it up with him anyway. Problem. He's totally disinterested. He's definitely otherwise like on your other shoulder, like trying to get something else. It would be more convenient if the voice were just like both really intensely together. Yeah. But you can see how that happens too, because like these guys are really good, and they like immediately check. Like one of them goes, yeah, like one of them goes down a little bit early. Like not even early, we're all in bed, we're down to the ground, and then they do something else. Like they're like, where's the other guy? Put him in the crib. Yeah. Where are they? You know, where they check. Yeah, so it's like if you pick up, best practice in the world. I think based on adult swim's experience. Yeah, my sister's trip. She yeah, or like anything, and you can see how this happens also. So you buy two toothbrushes. And then the parents know who's who all the time. I can totally get it. They're just like, well, the toothbrushes, you have the purple one, and in the like shoes, you have the one. I'm gonna. You can come and take your picture. I'm scared. Like sometimes.
It's a good judge of the character.
My kids are really there. Count for me. Oh, really? Yeah, like this morning. This morning, and go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom. And he went outside the door. And she lost. Like, oh, she was crying. Like, it's okay. He's right there. But hi, Dad. Yeah, you're in through the door. He's fine. I'm potty. It's okay. Shh. And I was like comforting her. And then Callum, who is comforting me, was like, oh, me, because Disney was getting a hug and he wasn't. So I'm like two bawling, clamoring, sweaty children on me, and like sitting in the hallway outside the bathroom door. And Andrew was going to like this. One child was eating. Oh, really? He doesn't. He's the guy who carries around the train. Oh, he's an engineer. I love how they're all
Callum is the one that is
he's clingy to me, yeah, and he also insists on they do it at the daycare for his parents. Really? As well. I can hardly do it. So he puts it in, and he loves it, and he touches it the whole time. I actually called out, and he cries, like, comes to you if you laugh. Oh my god, I'm trying to get ready for work.
well, you cannot do this by class. It goes like
I know. There's a lot of, yeah.
a lot of the funny things happen.
Yeah, this morning they found all various blankets. All of them.
They're all trying.
Yeah, they're like breaking other.
So when they're going to daycare, that's why they're having the
Yeah. Well, no, it's an actual I like it actually, but that's what probably they don't necessarily do it at daycare, but they do it all the time.
just if you move.
Oh yeah, anytime. And daycare. Other times it doesn't matter what they do. There. She's doing the bathroom. Yeah.
Like, I mean, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was 2 years old, going to an elevator, doing this training.
Yeah.
And the stranger was from a country. And
Yeah.
she was always with her.
Yeah.
And to pay, she was that.
Yeah. Things like that.
Really?
Yeah. She definitely. No,
No,
she's like,
said she also cried.
oh, she cries for that.
For that.
That's what. I feel that a little bit.
Whatever.
Yeah.
Just leave them.
He's sort of like, when I get. Cal, and it's like, get in there.
I like that. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
It could, but that's the good thing about kids. Like super age, let's do, it doesn't really matter to them to
Yeah.
survival.
Yeah.
And it's a, whatever. So, pick up with somebody else. I feel like I remember
I was the third.
you're not, I had mom and grandma. Oh, sad.
But these guys are totally obsessed. You can't even say. Anna, Anna, Anna. Go looking for her.
You do that for your kid, like that?
Yeah. That's great. She sees them quite often.
I love hearing about it. I don't know if I would want to.
I like telling you about it because that gives you things that it's awesome.
I really do. Like, I think there is nothing better than having a nice, like, big family.
Yeah, we probably don't. I'll just. No. Well, it's that big.
for a few seconds on a break.